The first time I realized my parents were celebrating while I was fighting to stay alive, I was lying in a dialysis chair with a needle in my arm. My name is Mara, and for 11 months, dialysis had been the center of my life. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday I woke before sunrise, carried my little blue medical folder, and drove to the clinic while the rest of the neighborhood was still asleep. I hated those mornings, but I hated being alone even more. That was why I had been grateful when my parents, Paul and June, moved into my spare bedroom after my kidneys failed. My mother cooked for me. My father helped around the house. They made me believe that even though my body was failing, I still had a family standing beside me. That Tuesday morning I was halfway through my treatment when my phone vibrated. It was my neighbor Nell. "Are you having people over today?" I smiled when I read it. I assumed Mom had invited relatives. "Probably," I typed back. "My parents like having company." Then another message appeared. "There are 12 cars outside your house." My smile slowly disappeared. I stared at those words until my fingers began to tremble. I called my mother. She answered almost immediately. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" "Mom," I swallowed. "What's happening at the house?" For several seconds she said nothing. Then in the gentlest voice imaginable she whispered, "Don't worry about that. Just finish your treatment." I looked down at the tubes carrying my blood through the machine. And for the first time, I wondered what my parents were doing inside my house while I was fighting to stay alive. When I finally came home from dialysis that afternoon, I was so exhausted that even turning the key in the front door felt like work. The moment I stepped inside I smelled chicken soup. Mom appeared from the kitchen wearing the same soft smile she had given me every day since she moved in. "You're home, sweetheart." She walked over, touched my forehead, and immediately complained that I looked too pale. "You never eat enough after treatment." For a moment, everything felt normal again. Dad was sitting in my favorite chair reading the newspaper. A blanket had already been folded over the armrest for me. I almost forgot about the 12 cars Nell had mentioned. Almost. I walked into the kitchen and opened the dishwasher. There were wine glasses inside. Dozens of them. I stared at them. Mom noticed. "Oh, those." She quickly dried her hands. "Some friends stopped by earlier." I nodded slowly. "Friends?" "Yes. Just friends." I didn't want to accuse her of anything. Not after everything she had done for me. So I smiled. "I'm sorry I asked." Mom came closer and kissed my forehead. "You don't have to apologize for asking questions in your own house." Those words should have comforted me. Instead they stayed in my mind. Later I noticed something else. One of my grandmother's old glasses was sitting beside the sink. There was a red lipstick mark around the rim. I picked it up carefully. That glass meant more to me than my mother knew. Grandma had used it every Sunday when I was little. "Mom, why was this out?" She looked at it for a second. Then she shrugged. "I probably used it." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. That night I went upstairs and heard my parents whispering in the guest room. I couldn't understand the words. Then Mom laughed softly. I stood in the hallway listening. And strangely I smiled. Because that laugh reminded me of childhood. Of Dad coming home from work, Mom dancing badly in the kitchen, and me laughing until my stomach hurt. I went into my bedroom and closed the door. I told myself everything was fine. I had no idea that I was standing inside the last few days of the family I thought I knew. The next Thursday Nell came to my house carrying a casserole dish. I could tell something was wrong before she even said hello. She stood on my porch holding the dish with both hands, staring at me as if she was trying to decide whether telling me the truth would hurt me more than keeping it from me. "Come in," I said. She followed me into the kitchen and placed the casserole on the counter. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she looked at me and asked, "Mara, do you know about the parties?" My stomach tightened. "What parties?" Nell sighed. "The ones your parents have been having." I tried to laugh. "They're just having friends over. Every week." I didn't answer. Nell reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I didn't want to show you this," she whispered. "But I think you deserve to know." She opened several photographs. My living room appeared on the screen. Except it didn't look like my living room. There were people everywhere. Drinks covered the tables. Decorations hung from the walls. Strangers were sitting on my grandmother's chairs. Then Nell showed me another photograph. My parents were standing near the front door. Paul was holding an envelope. June was collecting another one from a woman walking inside. I stared at the screen. What's in those envelopes? Nell looked down. Money. My mouth went dry. Why would people be giving my parents money? I don't know, she said. But I've watched it happen more than once. I sat down. My hands were shaking. I wanted to defend my parents. I wanted to find some innocent explanation. They're taking care of me, I whispered. Maybe people are just helping them. Nell didn't argue. Instead, she gently said, then why are they charging people to use your house? That question broke something inside me. I opened my laptop and checked my bank account. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then I looked closer. Small charges. Food deliveries. Decorations. Furniture rentals. Cleaning services. Payments I had ignored because I trusted my parents. Then I found something that made my heart stop. An event rental receipt. The customer's name was June. I stared at it for a long time. Nell touched my shoulder. Don't confront them yet. I looked at her. Why? Because if they're hiding something, Mara, you need to know what it is before you ask them. That night, for the first time, I stopped making excuses for my parents. And I started looking for the truth. I spent most of that night telling myself I shouldn't be doing it. Going through my parents' things felt wrong. They were still my parents. The same people who had sat beside me in hospital rooms, brought me soup and held my hand when I was terrified. But I couldn't forget what Nell had shown me. So I searched through the closet where I kept old boxes from my grandmother. That's where I found the camera. It was an old security camera my grandmother had installed years ago after someone broke into the neighborhood. I had completely forgotten about it. My hands trembled as I connected the storage drive to my laptop. The first few hours of footage showed nothing unusual. Mom folding laundry. Dad watering the plants. My parents eating dinner. I almost shut the laptop. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe Nell had misunderstood everything. Then the footage changed. I saw my living room filled with people. Music was playing. Tables had been pushed against the walls and decorations covered the shelves. My grandmother's photographs had been removed. I leaned closer to the screen. There was my father standing near the entrance. A man handed him an envelope. Paul slipped it into his pocket. I stopped breathing. Then I saw my mother. She was laughing with several guests. I watched another recording. It was from one of my dialysis days. I could see myself leaving the house that morning. A few minutes later, Dad walked into the living room with several strangers. One man asked, "She'll be gone long?" Dad laughed. "She'll be gone most of the afternoon." My chest tightened. I paused the video. For several seconds I couldn't move. Then I pressed play again. Another guest looked around the room. "Is this really her house?" Paul nodded. "She won't care. She's too tired to notice anything." I covered my mouth. I wanted to believe he hadn't said it. But I had heard every word. Then another voice asked something that made my blood run cold. "What happens to the house if she doesn't make it?" Paul looked toward June. My mother didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the floor. I paused the footage again. Tears filled my eyes. I remembered my first dialysis treatment. I remembered Mom sitting beside me, squeezing my hand while I cried. I remembered Dad bringing me flowers afterward. Those memories suddenly felt like photographs from someone else's life. I whispered to the empty room, "Who are you?" And for the first time I was afraid to press play again. I didn't stop watching. Even though every part of me wanted to close the laptop, I needed to know how far the lie went. I pressed play again. The footage showed another party at my house. People were laughing, drinking, and moving through rooms that had once belonged only to my family. My mother's voice came from somewhere near the kitchen. Someone asked, "Does Mara know about these parties?" My father laughed. "She doesn't know anything." Then another person asked, "What happens if she gets a transplant?" There was silence. My mother finally answered, "The doctors don't know if she'll get one." Someone asked the question that made my hands go cold. "And if she doesn't?" My father looked toward my mother. Then he said, "Honestly, I hope she doesn't drag this out." My mother whispered something. I couldn't hear it. Then she said clearly, "We hope she dies quickly." Everything inside me stopped. I stared at the screen. I didn't cry immediately. I couldn't. My mind simply refused to understand what I had heard. I rewound the recording. "We hope she dies quickly." The same words. I finally pushed the laptop away and covered my face. A sound escaped my throat that I barely recognized. I I had spent 11 months fighting for my life. 3 days every week I allowed strangers to put needles into my body because I wanted more time. More birthdays. More mornings. More ordinary dinners with my parents. And while I was fighting that hard to stay alive, my own mother had said she hoped I would die quickly. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired. Older than 39. But I was still me. I remembered Mom holding my hand during my first dialysis session. I remembered Dad sleeping in a hospital chair when I had pneumonia at 10. I remembered him teaching me how to ride a bicycle. I remembered Mom making pancakes on Sunday mornings. Those memories hurt more than the recording. Because I couldn't suddenly turn them into lies. Maybe they had loved me once. Maybe they still did. That was the part one couldn't understand. I slid down the bathroom wall and pulled my knees against my chest. For the first time since my kidneys failed, I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of surviving long enough to understand that the people I loved most had been waiting for me to disappear. The next morning I couldn't stop thinking about my grandmother's brass key. I searched through the boxes she had left behind, hoping I would find something that could explain why my parents had always been so protective of the house. Underneath some old photographs I found the key inside a small wooden box. Beneath it was a letter with my name written across the envelope in my grandmother's handwriting. My hands began shaking before I even opened it. She had written the letter when I was 16, telling me that the house was supposed to be my safe place. She wanted me to always have somewhere I could return to, no matter what happened in our family. As I read those words, I remembered an argument between my grandmother and my parents years ago. I had been too young to understand it then. Now everything suddenly made sense. I took the documents to Ruth, an attorney my grandmother had once trusted. She carefully reviewed them and told me something I never expected. My parents didn't own the house. They had no legal right to sell it, borrow against it, or treat it as theirs. They had simply been living there because I trusted them. I stared at Ruth and asked the question that frightened me most. If I make them leave, who will take care of me? Ruth didn't answer immediately. She looked at me with compassion and said, "Mara, needing help doesn't mean you have to accept betrayal as the price of receiving it." Those words stayed with me. I began arranging transportation to dialysis, medication deliveries, and someone who could help me at home. Every phone call felt like admitting that the people I had depended on were no longer safe. That evening I made my mother's favorite chicken soup. I set 3 bowls on the table without thinking. For a few seconds I waited for Dad to walk in and complain that I had used too much salt. Then I looked at the empty chairs. My throat tightened. Slowly I picked up one bowl and put it back in the cupboard. I stood there alone, realizing that protecting myself might be the hardest thing I had ever done. I decided I would confront my parents without warning. I couldn't keep watching recordings and pretending I didn't know what they had said about me. On Tuesday morning I left for dialysis as usual, but I arranged for my ride to bring me home before my treatment was finished. My hands were shaking the entire way. When I opened the front door, music was playing. My living room was filled with strangers. People were sitting in my grandmother's chairs, drinking from glasses I had inherited from her. For a moment nobody moved. Then everyone turned toward me. My mother went completely pale. My father stood up so quickly that his chair scraped across the floor. "Mara," he whispered. I looked around the room and quietly asked, "How long?" My mother began crying. Dad tried to explain that they were only trying to survive, that everything had become expensive, that they were afraid of what would happen if I died. I listened until he finished, then asked, "Survive what?" He couldn't answer. I pointed toward the door. I was the one fighting to survive. My mother stepped toward me. "Sweetheart, please." I pulled the brass key from my pocket and placed it on the table. "This house was Grandma's gift to me. And you turned it into a place where strangers paid to celebrate while I was connected to a dialysis machine." Dad looked away. I opened my phone and played the recording. The room became completely silent when my mother's voice came through the speaker. "We hope she dies quickly." Mom covered her mouth and collapsed into a chair. "I didn't mean it," she sobbed. I looked at her through tears. "I know you didn't mean to say it to me. You meant it when you thought I couldn't hear." Dad tried to apologize, but I stopped him. "Do you know what I wanted while you were planning for my death?" I asked. "Another birthday. Another Christmas. Another morning where I woke up and heard my mother making coffee." My voice broke. "You were preparing for my funeral while I was preparing to live." Nobody in the room spoke. Then I looked at my parents and said the words that terrified me most to say, "You need to leave my house." My parents didn't leave screaming or slamming doors. That somehow made it worse. They packed slowly, quietly, as if they were simply moving out of an ordinary home. Mom folded her clothes with trembling hands. Dad stood in the guest room staring at the walls like he was trying to memorize them. Before leaving, Mom walked into the kitchen and looked at me. "Will you call if you need help?" The question almost broke me. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to run into her arms and pretend none of this had happened. But I couldn't. "I don't know," I whispered. Mom nodded, but tears were already running down her face. When the front door finally closed behind them, the house became completely silent. I walked through every room alone. That's when I started noticing things I had never seen before. A scratch across my grandmother's wooden chair. A crack in the kitchen cabinet. My childhood books pushed into a corner. Cigarette ashes inside one of my grandmother's plant pots. Tiny pieces of strangers' lives were scattered throughout the house. I sat on the floor and cried. I wasn't crying because I missed the house. I was crying because I missed the parents I thought I had. Later that night, I became dizzy while walking toward the bathroom. My knees suddenly weakened. I reached for the wall and slid onto the floor. For one terrifying moment, my hand went straight toward my phone. I opened my contacts. Mom's name was right there. I stared at it. My thumb hovered over the call button. I wanted my mother. Even after everything, I wanted my mother. But I couldn't call her. Said I called Nell. She arrived within minutes. She found me sitting on the bathroom floor, crying and shaking. She didn't ask me to explain. She simply sat beside me and held my hand. For the first time in my life, I realized something painful. Family wasn't always the people whose blood ran through your veins. Sometimes family was the person who showed up when you were at your weakest. And that night, Nell was the only person who did. Weeks passed without hearing from my parents. I kept going to dialysis 3 times a week. I took my medications, followed my doctor's instructions, and tried to rebuild a life that no longer included the people I had depended on most. But healing wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be. I still missed Mom's soup. I missed Dad's terrible jokes. Sometimes, after dialysis, I would unlock my front door and instinctively expect to hear my mother asking whether I had eaten. Then one night at exactly 2 a.m. my phone rang. It was Mom. For several seconds I just stared at her name. I almost let it go to voicemail. But some part of me still needed to hear her voice. I answered. "Hello." There was silence. Then Mom whispered, "Are you awake?" I closed my eyes. Yes. She started crying. Not the kind of crying she had done when I asked her to leave. This time she sounded completely broken. "I replay that recording every night," she said. "I hear myself saying those words and I don't recognize who I became." I didn't respond. She continued. "I was scared, Mara. I was scared of losing you. I was scared of losing everything. I was scared of becoming old and helpless. And somehow I turned all that fear into something horrible." My voice trembled. "Did you want me dead?" She was silent for so long that I already knew the answer would hurt. "No," she finally whispered. "But I wanted your suffering to end because I was tired of being afraid. And I made your illness about me." Tears rolled down my cheeks. For the first time, she wasn't asking me to forgive her. She wasn't asking to come home. She was simply telling me the truth. "I still love you, Mom," I whispered. She began crying harder. "But love isn't enough for me to let you back into my life yet." "I understand," she said. Before we hung up, she asked quietly, "Have you been eating?" I laughed through my tears. It was the most Mom question she could have asked. But I still didn't invite her home. One morning, my transplant coordinator called and told me there might be a kidney available. I had to get to the hospital immediately for testing. I grabbed my little blue medical folder, the same one I had carried to every dialysis session, and found my grandmother's photograph still tucked inside. Nell drove me to the hospital while I sat quietly in the passenger seat, terrified to hope. The test took hours. I kept thinking about everything I had survived and wondering if my body would finally give me a chance to live. When the doctor finally walked in and told me the transplant was approved, I covered my face and cried. Nell squeezed my hand, and for the first time in a long time, my tears weren't only from pain. The surgery was difficult, but I woke up alive. My phone was filled with messages. One was from Dad. One was from Mom. I opened hers first. She hadn't asked me to forgive her or come home. She had only written, "You don't have to answer. I just wanted you to know I'm praying you're still here." I stared at those words for a long time before putting the phone down. After my recovery, I returned to my house. I replaced the damaged things one by one and kept my grandmother's chair exactly where it had always been. I changed every lock and finally put the blue folder inside a drawer because I no longer needed to carry it everywhere. I placed the brass key beside it. One afternoon, sunlight filled the kitchen as I sat at the table. My phone vibrated. It was Mom again. I looked at her name for a long time. I still wasn't ready to bring her back into my life, but I was no longer consumed by anger. I opened the message and typed 4 words, "I'm still here, Mom." I sent it, placed the phone face down and took a slow breath. Then I picked up my spoon and began eating. For the first time, the silence in my house didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. My story may be over, but I want to hear from you. Subscribe for a new story every day and hit like before you leave. Then tell me honestly, could you forgive your parents after they betrayed you while you were fighting for your life? I read your comments and I'll see you in the next story.